Mirza Ali Muhammad, who afterwards assumed the title of Bab, which means gate, was born at Shiraz in the south of Persia on the 20th of October, 1819 AD. He was a Sayyid, that is, a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. His father, a well-known merchant, died soon after his birth, and he was then placed under the care of a maternal uncle, a merchant of Shiraz, who brought him up. In childhood, he learned to read and received the elementary education customary for children.
At the age of 15, he went into business, at first with his guardian and afterwards with another uncle who lived at Bushir on the shore of the Gulf of Persia for a period of 5 years. In 1841 AD, he traveled to the holy cities in Iraq and stayed there for a year. He met Sayyid Kazim Rashti and attended some of his lectures. He married when about 22 years of age. Of this marriage, one son was born, who died while still an infant in the first year of the Bab's public ministry. The Bab revealed few works during this period and prior to his declaration, such as Epistle of Jurisprudence, Epistle on the Right Guidance on the Path, Epistle on the Right Behavior. He also started a lengthy commentary on the second chapter of Quran, and it completed it sometime after his declaration.
On reaching his 25th year, in response to divine command, he declared God the Exalted had elected him to the station of Babhood. In those days, belief in imminent appearance of a divine messenger was especially prevalent among the sect known as the Sheikhis, and it was to a distinguished divine belonging to this sect, called Mullah Hussein Bushuri, that the Bab first announced his mission. The exact date of this announcement is 2 hours and 11 minutes after sunset, on the eve preceding the 23rd of May, 1844 AD, at Shiraz in his home. After some days of anxious investigation and study, Mullah Hussein became firmly convinced that the messenger long expected by the Shiites had indeed appeared. His eager enthusiasm over this discovery was soon shared by several of his friends. Before long, the majority of the Sheikhis accepted the Bab and became known as Babis. The first 18 disciples of the Bab, with himself as the 19th, became known as Letters of the Living. The Bab summoned to his presence Mullah Ali Bastami, one of the 18 Letters of the Living, and instructed him to proceed directly to Najaf and Karbala to announce the glad tidings of the Bab, then summoned to his presence the remaining Letters of the Living, and to each severally. He gave special command and appointed a special task. For Mullah Hussein, the Bab instructed him to journey to Isfahan, Kashan, and Tehran on a special mission, and to return to the holy cities in Iraq afterwards, and after further instruction from him. The Bab decided to undertake his contemplated pilgrimage to Mecca. Qudus, one of the Letters of the Living, was his only companion and his personal attendant. In September 1844, the Bab left Shiraz to the port of Bashir. The Bab stayed in Shiraz for about 4 months after his declaration. Some of his most known works during that period, the commentary of the Surah of Joseph and Sahife Maksumihe, consist of 14 prayers for different religious events. The Bab arrived in Bushehr after 10 days of travel from Shiraz and stayed in Bushehr for about 13 days. After completing his arrangements for his long and arduous voyage, he embarked on a sailing vessel headed towards Mecca. After 2 days of sailing, the vessel stopped in Kangan before continuing towards Mecca. The Bab revealed a sermon while in Kangan known as the Sermon of Kangan. After 12 days of sailing, the vessel arrived to Muscat from Bushehr, as mentioned by the Bab in the Persian Bayan. There the Bab addressed a letter to the leading clergy announcing his declaration to him. Upon his arrival to Jeddah, the Bab donned his pilgrim's garb, mounted a camel, and set out on his journey to Mecca. No sooner had the Bab performed the last of the observances in connection with his pilgrimage to Mecca, and declaring his mission in public next to the Kaaba, he addressed multiple individuals, including the Sheriff of Mecca. To the Sheriff he addressed him with a letter wherein he set forth, in clear, unmistakable terms, the distinguishing features of his mission, and called upon him to arise and embrace his cause. The Sheriff, however, too absorbed in his own material pursuits to incline his ear to the words which have been addressed to him by the Bab, failed to respond to the call of the divine message. After a stay of 26 days, the Bab departed to Medina. In Medina, the Bab visited the prophetic mosque, the second holiest site in Islam, and the resting place of Muhammad. The initial plan was for the Bab to travel by land from Medina to the holy cities in Iraq, but he changed his plans and decided to travel back to Bushehr by sea. After a stay of 27 days, the Bab departed Medina to Jeddah. On his way back to Bushehr, the Bab revealed many letters and sermons while in Medina, including an epistle while traveling from Mecca to Medina, called the Epistle Between Two Holy Shrines. In Jeddah, the Bab made arrangements to sail back home on the same vessel he arrived with. After a stay of 8 days, the vessel departed. The first stop of the sailing vessel on the way back was in Mocha in Yemen, a small port on the Red Sea. It is unknown when the Bab arrived or how long he stayed there. The second stop was in Muscat, for the second time where the Bab stayed for a short period of time before departing towards Bushehr. While in Muscat, the Bab revealed multiple letters, such as the letter to the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Majid, a letter to the Ottoman governor of Baghdad, Najib Pasha, a second letter to the leading clergy of Muscat, a letter to the clergy of Bushir, a letter to his uncle, and many others. After a journey of a little bit over 2 months from Jeddah, the sailing vessel arrived in Bushir. In Bushir, he stayed for about 2 months, then set out to his birth city, Shiraz. The Bab revealed many letters while in Bushir, such as the 7 Qualifications, a treatise in which he set forth the essential requirements from those who had attained to the knowledge of the new revelation and had recognized its claim. Kitab-i-Firest is another one, wherein the Bab listed the names of all works that he has revealed until that moment. The Bab also wrote while the vessel was sailing. One such major work was called Kitab-i-Ruh. The Bab's arrival to Shiraz marked the end of his pilgrimage journey that took a full year to complete.
When the Bab returned to Shiraz from pilgrimage, great excitement was caused by the announcement of his Babhood. The Shiite doctors vehemently denounced him and persuaded the governor of Fars to undertake the suppression of the new heresy. The Bab was arrested, examined, severely rebuked, and violently struck in the face, but eventually released to the custody of his maternal uncle. The Bab spent approximately 15 months in Shiraz before leaving to Esfahan, when an outbreak of cholera had spread. The writings of the Bab were voluminous, and the rapidity with which, without study or premeditation, he composed elaborate commentaries, profound expositions, or eloquent prayers, was regarded as one of the proofs of his divine inspiration. The following are some of the best-known works of the Bab during this period: Commentary on the Surah of Kosar, Commentary on the Surah Qadr, Commentary on the Surah of Tawheed, Commentary on the letter Ha, Treatises on Islamic jurisprudence, the Epistle of the Branches of Justice, the Golden Epistle.
The Bab arrived to Esfahan in the summer of 1846 AD and spent the first 40 days as a guest in the house of one of the principal ecclesiastical dignitaries of the city, who ceremoniously received the Bab and treated him extremely well. Crowds of people flocked from every quarter of the city to obtain the presence of the Bab for different reasons, and many accepted his claims. But the Shia doctors of the city vehemently denounced him as heretic, condemning him to death. The Shah himself was induced to summon the Bab to his capital, Tehran. At that time, the pious governor of Esfahan, Manuchehr Khan, who initially admired the Bab and eventually became a believer, transferred the Bab to his own residence. But after a few months, the governor passed away, and the Shah issued a second summons, ordering the Bab to the capital. In the company of mounted escort, the Bab set out in the direction of Tehran in accordance with the Shah's instructions. The following are some of the best-known works of the Bab during this period: the commentary on the Surah of Wal Asr, the commentary on the validity of the specific mission of the Prophet Muhammad, and the epistle on music.
On the eve preceding the third Nowruz, after the declaration of his mission, which fell on the 20th of March 1846 AD, the Bab arrived to the city of Kashan on the way to Tehran and stayed over for 3 nights in the house of Mirza Kashani, a noted resident of that city. On the morning of the second day after Nowruz, the Bab left again towards Tehran in the company of the same mounted escort.
After 2 days of travel, the Bab arrived at the village of Gomrud and stayed the night.
And after another 2 days of travel, the Bab arrived to the fortress of Kanargerd on the road to Tehran. When a messenger unexpectedly arrived from Tehran bearing a written order from the Prime Minister of Mohammad Shah to the leader of the escort, instructing him to proceed immediately with the Bab to the village of Kolain.
And after 2 days of travel, the Bab arrived to the village of Kolain and stayed there for 2 weeks. There, the Bab received a letter from Muhammad Shah informing him of a change in plans, ordering him to proceed to Tabriz on the way to the castle of Mahku in the province of Azerbaijan.
On the way to Tabriz, the Bab stopped in the village of Siah-Dehan, in the neighborhood of Qazvin. From there, the Bab addressed an epistle to the Prime Minister of Muhammad Shah and wrote several tablets addressed to the leading ulamas in Qazvin.
The Bab arrived in Tabriz and was conducted to one of the chief houses in that city, which had been reserved for his confinement. With the exception of few, neither the public nor his followers were allowed to meet him. After a stay of 40 days, he departed to the castle of Maku.
In Maku, no one was permitted to visit the Bab. Eventually, the Bab persuaded the frontier office in charge of the castle to alter his attitude towards the believers who visited him. At night, the gate of the castle was still closed. In the daytime, however, those whom the Bab desired to see were allowed to enter his presence, were able to converse with him and receive his instructions. As he lay confined within the walls of the castle, he devoted his time to the composition of the Persian Bayan, the most weighty, the most illuminating and comprehensive of all his works. In it he laid down the laws and precepts of his dispensation, plainly and emphatically announced the advent of a subsequent revelation, and persistently urged his followers to seek and find him whom God would make manifest. The following are some of the best-known works of the Bab during this period: the Persian Bayan, the 7 Proofs, Epistle to Muhammad Shah, Epistle to Prime Minister of Muhammad Shah, 9 commentaries on the Quran, Arabic Bayan. After a stay of 7 months, the Bab was transferred to the castle of Chirqiq by the command of the Prime Minister.
In Chihriq, Strict instructions had been given by the Prime Minister to the officer in charge of the castle not to allow anyone to enter the presence of the Bab. But soon the officer came to feel the fascination of his prisoner. He too forgot, as soon as he came into contact with his spirit, the duty he was expected to perform. After a stay of 3 months, the Bab was summoned to Tabriz to be examined by the political and religious leaders.
The Bab left Shirkuh towards Tabriz, but those into whose custody he was delivered thought it inadvisable to pass through the town of Goy, which lay on their route to Tabriz. They decided to go by way of Urumiyeh and thus avoid the demonstrations which the excited populace were likely to make as a protest against the tyranny of the government. The Bab stayed in Urumiyeh for a period of 10 days, then proceeded to Tabriz. The news of the impending arrival of the Bab had inflamed the imagination of its inhabitants and had kindled the fiercest animosity in the hearts of the ecclesiastical leaders of Azerbaijan. Such was the fervor of popular enthusiasm which the news had evoked that the authorities decided to house the Bab in a place outside the gates of the city. After a few days, the Bab was summoned to the official residence of the governor for the express purpose of arraigning him. During the examination, the Bab was asked, "Who do you claim to be, and what is the message which you have brought?" "I am," thrice exclaimed the Bab. I am the promised one. I am the one whose name you have for 1,000 years invoked, and whose mention you have risen, whose advent you have longed to witness, and the hour of whose revelations you have prayed God to hasten. Verily I say, it is incumbent upon the peoples of both the East and the West to obey my word, to pledge allegiance to my person. The Bab was asked again, "The claim which you have advanced is a stupendous one. It must needs be supported by the most incontrovertible evidence." "The mightiest, the most convincing evidence of the truth of the mission of the Prophet of God," the Bab replied, "is admittedly his own word. He himself testifies to this truth. The power to produce such evidence has been given to me by God. Within the space of 2 days and 2 nights, I declare myself able to reveal verses of such number as will equal the whole of the Quran." The Bab's claims were rejected, and he was punished by striking his feet 11 times with rods. After a few days, the Bab was returned to the castle of Shirkuh.
The Bab returned to Shirkuh and stayed there for about 2 years. During that time, Muhammad Shah passed away, and his son Nasiruddin Shah replaced him, and he assigned a new prime minister by the name of Mirza Taqi Khan, who eventually summoned the Bab again to Tabriz. The following are some of the best-known works of the Bab during the Bab's stay in Shirkuh, before and after the first examination in Tabriz. 2 Epistles to Muhammad Shah. Epistle to the Prime Minister of Muhammad Shah. Book of Names. Book of the 5 Modes. Book of Jaza.
The Bab arrived for the 3rd time to Tabriz in July 1850 AD. 3 days after his arrival, a fresh order was received from the Prime Minister to execute the Bab. A firing squad consisting of 750 soldiers executed the Bab. Aged 30 and his disciple, Mirza Muhammad Ali Zunuzi, known as Anis, meaning companion, in a courtyard square of a military barracks near the citadel. The martyrdom of the Bab took place at noon on Sunday, the 9th of July, in the year 1850 AD. 31 lunar years, 7 months, and 27 days from the day of his birth in Shiraz.
On the evening of that same day, the mangled bodies of the Bab and his companion were removed from the courtyard of the barracks to the edge of the moat outside the gate of the city. 4 companies, each consisting of 10 sentinels, were ordered to keep watch in turn over them. On the afternoon of the second day after the Bab's martyrdom, Haji Suleiman Khan, a disciple of the Bab, arrived at Tabriz. No sooner had his host informed him of the martyrdom of the Bab than he instantly resolved to carry away the bodies of the victims. He succeeded, with help from his host, in the middle of that same night, in bearing the bodies from the edge of the moat to a safe place in Tabriz and placed them in a casket. Haji Suleiman Khan immediately reported the matter to Baha'u'llah, who was then in Tehran, and who instructed his brother to dispatch a special messenger to Tabriz for the purpose of transferring the bodies to the capital. After the arrival of the special messenger from Tehran, Haji Suleiman Khan and others wrapped the casket in cotton and prepared for the journey. They would go by horseback, traveling during the cool of the night along the rocky pathways through the hills and mountains. After traveling for about 300 kilometers, they arrived to Zanjan, a town some 330 kilometers from Tehran. They spent the night there before resuming their journey to Tehran. The whole journey from Tabriz to Tehran, including likely rest stops, would probably have taken a week. For almost 49 years, the sacred remains of the Bab were kept in many safe places in Tehran and its surroundings, and for most of the times they were kept hidden away in different Islamic shrines and in homes of some believers. The sacred remains were also moved from one place to another as needed and in accordance with Baha'u'llah's instructions. In the spring of 1898 AD, about 6 years after the ascension of Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha ordered that the casket of the Bab be brought from Persia to the Holy Land. He entrusted the mission to a believer by the name of Mirza Asadullah Isfahani, who was instructed to recover the casket, then transfer it to Isfahan. Mirza Asadullah recovered the casket from its last hiding place in Tehran. He then set off towards Isfahan with the assistance of other believers. First, they headed off towards Qum, 150 kilometers south of Tehran, and stored the casket there for 3 days before heading off again towards Isfahan, about 315 kilometers south of Qum. On the way to Isfahan, they passed through Kashan, Natanz, Tar, and Tark.
After a short stay in Isfahan, Abdu'l-Baha sent new instructions to transfer the casket from Isfahan to Baghdad. Mirza Asadullah set out on the 1,000 kilometers journey to Baghdad. On the way, they stopped over in Najafabad, Iraq, Hamadan, Kermanshah, stopping over as need to rest. Then they crossed the border without incident, passing through Khani Khan before heading southwest to Baghdad. After a short stay in Baghdad, instructions came from Abdu'l-Baha to move the casket onto Beirut. Mirza Asadullah and his colleagues traveled through the vast desert to Damascus, 850 kilometers away, and from there to the coastal city of Beirut. In Beirut, the casket was concealed in the home of a believer, awaiting further instructions from Abdu'l-Baha. Despite efforts to maintain secrecy, the news of the impending arrival of Mirza Asadullah and his colleagues had somehow leaked to disloyal family members in Akka, 110 kilometers to the south of Beirut. Through the wisdom and guidance of Abdu'l-Baha, the casket arrived to Akka by sea and passed through customs without incident. First, the casket was kept at Mirza Asadullah's house, and a few days later was moved to the house of Abdu'l-Baha in Akka, and stored in the room of his sister Bahia Khanum for about a year. In 1900 AD, the casket was secretly moved from Bahia Khanum's room and taken to the other side of the bay, where it was concealed in the house that Abdu'l-Baha had rented in Haifa. Later on, Abdu'l-Baha took the necessary steps of preparations to complete the implementation of the mission given to him by Baha'u'llah to enter the sacred remains of the Bab in their permanent resting place. On the holy day of Nowruz, 21st of March, 1909 AD, a Sunday, Abdu'l-Baha laid the sacred remains in their ordained spot with his own hands and in the presence of believers from the east and the west.